Welcome to this texturing tights in CLO3D tutorial. We're starting off with part 1, which is exchanging textures. We're just gonna start with a basic pair of tights that I showed you how to do in the previous workshop, and it just has really basic texture on it. It's just a knit texturing and the rib on the waistband. Now we're gonna click in the object browser and we're gonna check in the property editor. We're gonna delete the materials that are currently there and exchange them with some other materials. In my case, I just added in a net texture. I actually took a picture, so just like a screenshot online, and I made a repeat in Photoshop. And now you can see here the problematic that you have with texturing tights in CLO3D, because you have to shrink around the ankles a lot. So if this is done in the wrong way or too harsh, then you get these horrible lines that wouldn't be there if you were having a knitted pair of tights, a real pair of tights. So we want to avoid that, and we have to change that. But I really wanted to show you what's causing this, and in this case it's the steam tool. So when the texture is too wide around the ankles, I use the steam tool to make it fit better. So that's an issue. So what you can do now is we go into the edit texture tool, and you can scale it in size. You can make it smaller, larger, etc. And it's just super easy to navigate. What we're not allowed to forget is to also add in a normal map. In Photoshop we can also generate normal maps. Otherwise you would just go into some other texture maps creators online. Yeah, but like I said, you can also just download textures from Adobe Substance, for example, or several other texture libraries. Now I'm going to show you how to do a normal map in Photoshop from your drawing or from your creation. What I'm doing here is I'm just opening up my small little repeat, and then it's getting pretty easy. So we go to filter, and then we go to 3D, and then create normal map. And then you have to make some adjustments. It's not always super easy to get it right. So sometimes it doesn't really show the bumpiness really well. So sometimes I also just use online generators. But now I'm gonna file, export, and just export as a PNG. In CLO, we can now go back to our object browser and add in the normal map. And yeah, you won't see huge adjustments. But in this case, I re-edited it in, so I had to re-add it, but because I already adjusted the size. So I just wanted to make sure that CLO understood that it also has to scale the normal map in the right way. So better be safe and add it in again. In my case, I don't have a displacement map, I don't have a roughness map, so here online texture generators and texture map generators do definitely come with an advantage, because they also generate you those. So that's a little bit of a disadvantage when doing this in Photoshop. So also just check my coloring, and it's just black. You don't really see it that well. And now we have to tackle the steaming issue we still have in our texturing. Well, you will have seen in my construction video that I put it to 60 instead of 40. And usually I always do the steaming on 40 because it doesn't really make a huge difference. But then I forgot to readjust it again to 40. So now we're just removing all the steam on the selected patterns. and then we're doing a -40 adjustment, and we're going a little bit higher with the steaming, so it has a nicer flow. And then we simulate it back, and then there is no line visible. Okay, next thing up, let's learn how to texture with an application. Again, we're starting off with a super basic pair of tights, and then we're going into add application. And I just made a super small heart from a knitted heart. I just cut that out in Photoshop from another pair of tights, and I'm just drawing it up. You can also just do a right click, and then you can adjust the sizing as well with the measurements you want to have. Then I'm recoloring it because it still had some kind of nudie coloring behind it, and I'm making it smaller because in my opinion it's too big. What I also like to do is to play with the opacity values, especially with tights, because it makes it sometimes a little bit more natural, and it's so hard to get the degree of transparency right. So it really needs some training and some good eyesight, because you can't really go after the values you get from production, and you really have to define your own values. So what amount of then is your transparency or your opacity level. So I just added this application, and now we're gonna tile it as well, because I decided I just don't want to have one heart. So I'm gonna right click the application, go to tile, and then you can go around the x-axis, which means you can create this kind of bracelet look, ankle bracelet look, which is also quite cute. Or we're going in the y-axis, so we could create potentially a front seam or a back seam made of hearts, which is also quite a cute aesthetic when it comes to tights. So here we're moving it. Sometimes navigating is a little bit difficult, especially if you're on a high particle distance, a low particle distance, that's what I mean. So if your mesh is really fine, then the tights look way prettier, but it also takes quite a lot of time to move applications. And then we can also just do an all over pattern, and this is also quite cool. The only disadvantage is that you don't really can adjust the offset values, so I can't change what kind of pattern the heart should form. Like, should they just be like all over, or maybe have a different offset? The offset you can put in here is basically just going to raise the texture from the tights, which we don't want in tights, but we want this, for example, in like if you have embroidery or something. You can also just adjust angles, just some small adjustments, but no offset adjustments. If you want to tile something differently, then you have to do this manually in Photoshop and add it as an all over application, or use UV map editing. Okay, so another thing we can do is just duplicate it on the symmetric pattern, which is possible here if you have a symmetric pattern, and you can still see that the offset is way too high. If you then change back the angles, you do have to adjust it on both of the legs, so this doesn't work with the symmetric tool. Okay. I also need I just exchanged the tights texture underneath, so I have a scanned pair of tights with the Visu scanner, where I'm just exchanging the normal map and all the texture maps, because I think it looks a little bit more realistic. And yeah, so pretty easy. You just go in and put in all the maps. That's what we did in the previous section of the video. So just exchanging the texture maps is the easiest way to texture. You just have to select a fabric that kind of fits well for this garment and then exchange the texture maps. That's definitely an advantage if you have to generate all your textures digitally and you don't have a Visu scan and you don't have the possibility to measure in materials with a CLO kit. So if you're just an independent designer, then that's a pretty easy way to make it work and make it look like as if. Another thing that you see in tights is this kind of ripping edge. So if the tights are really high quality, for pulling them up over your butt area and your thighs, they have a little bit of a knitting done on the top around the waistband that's tighter. And that avoids ripping. So if you pull in your fingernails too hard, then it shouldn't rip there. And we also add this in as an application because it's the easiest way to do so. You go into render view, just have to wait a little bit. Then you can see on the top the application and how far away actually the application is of our body. So that doesn't look really nice. And then we're just readjusting the skin offset as well, because at first when I played around with the offset of the application, I thought it was the skin offset that was wrong here, but it's not the skin offset, so it's definitely the application offset. So if you need an offsetted application, then that's fine, but for tights we don't need it. What I've decided now is that I don't want to see the panties underneath. So I'm going into the avatar and I'm pulling in the new texture. And now I have to be careful that it's not visible on video. But with the new texture, it's more, I mean, it's not accurate, but I can see the texturing a little bit better. Rendering always takes a while just to create the previews. So now you can see we don't have our slip underneath anymore, and we can see the ripping border very well. That was it for texturing with applications. So be aware, application Z offset is not the skin offset. If you want to do tights, try to have it as low as possible. If you want to do embroidery, then you can go higher. So that's a learning lesson also for me that I've learned during the preparation of this tutorial. And now we're moving on to part 2 of texturing with application, is to play with placed application. And I decided to create some cool monster reliefs for that. So I just downloaded an image. For designing, guys, this is super fine. I mean, if you're designing a legwear designer, then, or you just need it as a pretty accessory, then it's quite cool to work with this. It gives you a lot of freedom. But the techniques in knitting tights are then way more complex, and also achieving this aesthetic is quite difficult. I mean, you can still use Photoshop. But what I've done now is just use the place application. I uploaded it and I just placed it and scaled it. And now I'm also adding the other one. Okay, and that's quite fun because you can really create patterns that later, if you want to have it knitted, or if you're really a legwear designer, then you can also just send this kind of pattern to the designers or the cut drawers, or use it as a base for your cut drawing if you also work with a cut program for knitwear or legwear. And then you can just use it, because in the end, if it's knitted, it will look a little bit differently, and you will have to scale the patterns a little bit differently, but it's a good base for the placements. And now I can also do some adjustments of the texture of it. So I decided that I want this to be a metal print. So sometimes you can also work with prints in tights, and a metal print is quite cool because it's also reflective, and it's definitely possible on tights. Maybe not in this huge scale, so the smaller the better, I would say, but it can give you a cool aesthetic. Here I decided to experiment with some velvet, so flocking on tights is also a possibility, or you can just create the aesthetic of it with a different knitting technique. So guys, this was it now for texturing with applications. So we tried out 2 versions, one by tiling and one by just placing textures and elements on it. And now we're moving on to UV map editing as a form of texturing. So here we just start out with a basic pair of tights again. We go into the UV editor on the top, right click and reset UV to 2D arrangement, and then fit all within 0 to -1, so that it's, or 0 to 1, that it's in the first bracket. We have that done, and then we can actually bake all the texture maps. So we go to bake textures, we create a new folder, so bake textures, in my case, really surprising. Okay, open, and then we can also select what kind of maps do we want to be tied into this UV map. Okay, so I decided to have a size of like around 6000, and I decided to bake all the texture maps, which maybe is a little bit too much. So usually I would just do the diffuse and the normal, and we're gonna open the diffuse map now in Photoshop because that's what we are working with. Okay, great. So we can see our texture. Usually what's also baked into it is all the other texture maps. So you would import this and it would come with the displacement map, the normal map, etc. So it's just the complete surface of it is baked into this. And you can also see the application that we have for the ripping border. And I'm just adding in now the 2 monster reliefs again. And we're gonna play with those. What's great about this is if you have a designer, or if you're working with a designer that doesn't know how to use 3D applications, then you can give them this and they can draw on it, for example. So if you're doing printed legwear, what's important if you import things is that you define it as a layer and not have it as a smart object. Then it's a little bit easier for you to navigate. So where was I? If you have a designer that doesn't know how to work with 3D applications, but they would like to see the placement they did of a texture first in 3D, it's not always super accurate, but it can work and help them out a lot. So if they just want to see the size of a repeat, for example, then it's quite easy to just give them this, and then you later on just have to upload it again in CLO on your finished pair of tights, and it goes super quick, so you can send them the variations that they decided on. So you just have to explain them what this is, so that it's kind of a pattern that you're working with. And later on, the cut technologist, or if you're the cut technologist, you can make the adjustments suitable for the material. But I'm just playing around here with the texturing, and that's fun, you know. You can just do some crazy things and see how it turns out. Not that that's super crazy, but it's just fun. So yeah, knitting and 3D simulation is difficult, especially circular knitting, because the material has such a huge influence of how the aesthetics are turning out. So sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming on how to solve certain issues or solve the fact that the tools are not there yet. But that's also a good challenge to learn and to experiment. Now I'm going to file, export, and export yeah, I'm just exporting it as a PNG. And later on, we're gonna go back to CLO. So it's time to go back to CLO and just upload this finished baked UV texture. Okay, I'm just selecting the basic texture of the tides. I'm deleting all of the other maps because they should be baked into it in theory. If they're not, just add them in back. And then we're opening up the texture, we're just loading it in just as like a normal texture file. The only thing we have to readjust, because now it looks horrible, we go to texture mapping and then select unified. This is super important because otherwise it will be all over the place. So it won't adjust automatically to your pattern. And that's why we also reset everything to 2D, reset to 2D arrangement, so it will look the same when it's on the pair of tides. So now in the render view we can see it's a little bit more subtle, as if you would add it onto with an application, because it also has the opacity values that came with it as well. So the opacity that we have adjusted previously is also showing here. But it's a pretty easy way. So I'm just turning up the opacity again to 100, so you can see the difference. That's also a lesson that you have to learn, that everything that you set there will also be in the UV map. And that's the advantage of the applications, that you can, or that you have two different values, right? So you can work with the application and the underneath material, whereas here your material is also your texturing in your application. So you don't have a lot of play. So you have to do a lot of adjustments in Photoshop. And it takes quite some time to understand. But hey guys, you made it to the end of this video. Thank you for watching.